And we're joined now by Lorraine Walton, a descendant of two children who were incarcerated in a Doukhobor camp. She joins us now from Victoria, where she traveled to attend the apology this morning. Lorraine, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you were there this morning. Talk to me about what it meant to hear those words, to hear that apology.
Yes, it was very moving, very spiritual lifting. We have waited for so many years. Both of my parents were in New Denver, Larry Potavinikoff and my mom, Vera Rishenkoff, and my uncle, Eddie Potavinikoff. So it's going to be 71 years since this tragedy had occurred. And my parents did not have a childhood. So in order to hear this apology, we actually finally felt validated. And I believe for those survivors, it made them feel that they were finally acknowledged, because they were not to blame for what occurred during that period.
Lorraine, this apology, before it came, it was also announced that there was going to be a $10 million compensation package aimed at reconciliation, is how it's been put. Talk to me about that amount of money. I've heard there's been some criticisms that it might not be enough.
You're correct in that remark. What they have proposed is $5 million to go to an education fund, 3.75 what they call a wellness and health. And then they have a 1.2 million for archiving and research. Well, for the elderly survivors who range between the age of 75 to 83, those that are still with us, it is much too late for education. And to give more into education than even into that wellness fund does not sit well with those survivors. Research and archive, like some survivors have said, well, what am I going to research? It's much too late. I don't even have a computer. Never mind, what am I going to research? I hope that this gets archived as to what has happened in this dark history, but there's still nothing offered as personal compensation. Now, today, the Premier did say that he is willing to sit down and to speak with the descendants and the survivors and to right this wrong. So we are anxiously awaiting to see what this next step is actually going to entail. But it's much too late for them to apply for trauma counseling.
Lorraine, so you're calling for personal compensation, and you're not alone. I have heard that really throughout the day and prior to from those who've been victimized here. What can you tell us about the personal stories of your three family members who were in these camps?
Well, I can tell you that my father was taken at 6. He wasn't even 7. He was there for 6 years, just under 6 years, 5 3/4. He had no childhood. He was always hungry. There was never enough food to keep them fed. Yes, they were fed eggs 3 times a day, and the rest of the food was terrible. My mom hid for 3 years before she was actually captured, and she hid in the wall and the floor, and she was there just under 2 years. My uncle, he was there for 6 years, and it traumatized all of them. They were not allowed to speak their native tongue, which is Russian. They were not allowed to wear their Doukhobor clothing as the little girls used to. They were slapped, they were punished if they spoke one word of Russian, and yet they did not know how to speak English. And they became child prisoners, and they became actually child slaves because they were forced to build the fence to keep their parents out. They used child labor to put in those posts, as shown by some pictures that we have, and survivors have shared those stories.
Lorraine, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a part of Canada's history that there are a lot of people who might be watching who would be unfamiliar with. What I'd like to ask you is how it's affected, I mean, it obviously has affected your parents and your uncle. How's it affected generations after? How's it affected you and growing up?
Yes, it did affect me. And I have 2 children, and I'm sure it affected them. My son is actually, one of my children is here with me in Victoria. To be here for support and know what his grandparents went through. Growing up with 2 parents, we had a lot of love in our home. I think my parents actually overcompensated a little bit because my father starved in New Denver, but we had so much food. And his words to us were always, we may not have any money, but we will always have food. And so at home, all our friends were always welcomed, and we were always allowed to go in what we had a root cellar. We grew up with no power, and we had a small little propane fridge. But we were always welcome to bring our friends to feed. Nobody ever left our home hungry. And so that was their trauma. My dad did not speak a lot about New Denver because he was so hurt.
Outside of the apology and the compensation, what more would you like to see from British Columbia toward the idea of reconciliation?
Well, I would really like to sit down with the government and to discuss this package. I would also like that with the media, and we so much appreciate you covering this story, it is something that the world needs to know about. This happened, and this happened to white children. This happened to Canadian children. They were not immigrants, they were born in Canada. And yet the Canadian government turned around and punished them. They did punish their parents. Some lost their licenses, their land. It was as if the government kind of held them hostage, that you can have this back if you send your child to school. One thing we do have to remember, they were never against education. It was what was being taught in the public school system. And I strongly believe it was the Doukhobor people that contributed to the homeschooling that exists today. Because we did have what we would call the private schools, where they were taught in their own language. And all they asked from the government was, let our children go to school for 4 days a week, no military, no standing up for the flag, and no marching, because that's what used to happen in the 50s. But the government refused to do that. And they thought that by Canadianizing these little children, that they would be better citizens. Well, their model failed, and all it did was cause hurt, anger. People turned away from their own culture because of what they were put through. Some had changed their names. And so as a first generation or second generation of having my parents in there, we lived with this every single day.
Lorraine Walton, I so appreciate you sharing your story with us and taking this time. As you say, it is an important part of Canada's history, and people need to be aware of it. Lorraine Walton is a descendant of 2 children that were incarcerated in a Doukhobor camp. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.